I'll hide my video
Alright.
while we're doing this.
Yeah, I'm gonna hide mine too. Is this recording? Play as recording. All right, John.
Okay, so just to see who we have, I know Jane. I was just talking with Joe. Looks like Shannon. Shannon, where are you?
I'm the Ratio Christi president at Western Washington University.
Western Washington. Where is that? What city?
That's in Bellingham, Washington. It's pretty close to Canada.
Yeah, I was for years and years and years, I was on the board of Camp Baraka down at Auburn, Washington. And I was actually born in the great state of Washington in Yakima, the other side of the Cascades. So I know the area well.
Oh, wonderful.
It looks
I
like,
lived in Puyallup for 13 years.
oh, Puyallup, sure. Yeah, that whole area there. Yeah, I know it well.
Beautiful.
It looks like, is Dan in the Philippines?
No, he's in Florida.
Florida. Who's in the Philippines? Anybody?
Nobody yet.
Nobody yet. And I see Chris by name only.
Hello, John. How are you? Dan
Hey,
from
Dan.
Florida.
Hi, Dan. What part of Florida?
Orlando.
Orlando. All right. And so who's Chris? There's Chris. And then Scott. Where's Scott?
I'm in Orlando as well.
All right. Good. I am in Orange County. So Jane, should I take it away?
Yes.
All right. I appreciate the opportunity to share with the Ratio Christi group. I was talking earlier with Joe about legal, constitutional issues and the study of law. My tent making, if you follow what Paul did in the book of Acts to pay his way, he made tents. So I say my tent making is as a trial lawyer, but my passion is teaching the Bible and sharing the gospel. So I consider myself a Christian apologist first and foremost, and then who happens to be a lawyer, and but don't hold that against me. I want to talk this evening about evidence and what type of evidence supports Christianity. What type of evidence do we have that is competent? That means the type of evidence that you would expect to be admitted in a courtroom. And if it is admitted, is it persuasive? Because you can have evidence admitted in a courtroom, but the jury or the judge doesn't believe it. So it has to also be compelling. And so are the claims of Christianity competent, and are they compelling? Let me tell you a couple of stories here. A book came out in 1972 written by a man named Mike Warnke. He claimed to be a satanic high priest before his conversion to Christianity. His book graphically depicts how he was involved in things like sex orgies in Southern California. And as a satanic high priest, he became well known after his conversion. He wrote a book called The Satan Seller, and he ended up being considered an expert on the whole area of Satanism, satanic ritual abuse. In 1980, a couple co-wrote a book called Michelle Remembers. First time the word ritual abuse was ever used, satanic ritual abuse. In other words, a cult was involved in abusing children. That was from 1980, best-selling book. Between 1984 and 1986, there were investigations into satanic ritual abuse in Bakersfield, California, that led to 26 people going to jail, including parents of some kids who were sentenced to 240 years in prison for ritually abusing their own children. 1983, Manhattan Beach, California had the famous McMartin case where the McMartin preschool allegedly was determined by the interviewers that over 350 children out of 400 had been ritually abused, and it resulted in 321 criminal counts in Los Angeles County, and leveled against 7 of the McMartin daycare workers by some 41 children. And among the claims were that the accused had built secret underground tunnels to transport kids to ritual ceremonies, and that they had actually ritually sacrificed a baby. And then Harvest House Publishers came out with a book called Satan's Underground. My second book was actually published by Harvest House, so I knew the people well. A book was written by a lady named Lauren Stratford, and she tells the story of how she was brought up in a satanic cult, and she became a baby breeder for human sacrifices for the cult. Her book was promoted by Hal Lindsey's sister-in-law, Johanna Michelson, who herself claimed in her book, The Beautiful Side of Evil, where she recounted her story of being a spirit medium and assisted in things like psychic surgery before her conversion to Christianity. So you've got Mike Warnke, the Satan Seller, you've got Lauren Stratford, Satan Underground, you've got the Bakersfield case, the McMartin case. All of these have actually two things in common. One, they turn around satanic activity, and especially satanic written abuse. And the second, all these stories are false, dead false. The people who went to prison were released eventually when it came out that the interviewers suggested these thoughts for these young children, and it was a total sham on criminal prosecution. Lauren Stratford, who wrote the book, The Satan's Underground, was exposed as being a total fraud. In fact, a book about Mike Warnke also came out called Selling Satan, which is an expose of all the lies this man taught, but he was good at it. And people believed him, despite the fact that he really didn't adduce any evidence. So we have to be careful as to whose testimony do we trust. So the question is, do we trust Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels, who give us the primary focus on the teachings and the life of Jesus? Are they to be believed? So we're going to be talking about eyewitness testimony, and how do we know something is competent, something that should be admissible in a courtroom, and how do we know whether or not it would be compelling, meaning it should be believed because it has a persuasive force to it. Testimony can come in the form of speaking, it can come in the form of documents, can come in the form of artifacts like a gun or a knife in a criminal case, documents in a civil case, or even a criminal case, or oral testimony, which is talking from the witness stand. Now, why eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. Eyewitness testimony. There's a lady who actually was at UC Irvine for a while. She's nationally renowned. Her name's Elizabeth Loftus. She has a PhD. And Elizabeth Loftus is probably the primary person who taught courses and has testified in trials about the unreliability of some eyewitness testimony. And some eyewitness testimony is confused because for whatever reason, sometimes over a period of time, people get their facts wrong, or they don't see things in the way it actually happened, or someone induces them to say something else. According to the Innocence Project, 358 people who've been convicted and sentenced to death in the United States since 1989 have been exonerated through DNA evidence. And of those, 71% were convicted through eyewitness misidentification. And they had served an average of 14 years in prison before their exoneration. And about 28% of those had false confessions. People actually do confess to crimes they didn't commit. This evening, I actually want to put Christianity on trial. I want to talk about, well, so what's the evidence? How do we know we're not dealing with Mike Warnke and the Satan Seller, Lauren Stratford, Satan's Underground? Is Christianity based on reliable eyewitness testimony? So now when we talk about a trial, here's the gavel. I usually tell people when I give a presentation, and Jane's probably heard this before, but you see on television how every time the judge goes to a recess, he bangs the gavel. Well, I have kept track of the number of times, and I've been a lawyer, I'm in my 4th decade now, how many times a judge has actually banged the gavel in a courtroom in California where I practice. And the answer, over 30 some years, how many do you think it would be? The answer is 0. It's a prop. They're not used in most courtrooms in California. Most judges have them as a prop. Little known facts of little value. But I'm going to put Christianity on trial. And a trial, in essence, is to determine what is the truth. In a criminal case, did the accused commit the crime? And in a civil case, the person who brings the case, the plaintiff, is their argument compelling to where you should find, the trier of fact should find for the plaintiff. And when I say trier of fact, in many countries, they don't have the jury system. They only have a judge who sits in and he or she listens to the arguments and determines what the facts are. In a jury trial, the jury determines what the facts are by listening to testimony, deciding who's telling the truth. The question is about truth. What is truth? Then the judge applies the law. If we put Christianity on trial, what would the verdict be? And of course, Christianity affirms that Jesus of Nazareth was God in the flesh, that he died for the sins of the world, that he rose from the dead as proof he was the Son of God, and that he's the Messiah. The question is, are his claims true? So let's talk about trials for a moment here. Now, in a criminal trial, the one who's accused is called the defendant, and the case is brought by the prosecution in America, and it's brought in the name of the people. So it's not the person, the prosecutor, but it's the name of the people. In my state, the people of the state of California versus O.J. Simpson, or whoever is being prosecuted. Now, the burden of proof is on the prosecution in a criminal case, and it's the highest burden possible, where you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt every element of the offense that's charged against the accused. And if any one of those elements necessary for that crime to be committed cannot be proven beyond reasonable doubt, then there is an acquittal. The person is found not guilty. It doesn't mean that they are morally innocent. It means they are legally not guilty. And not guilty doesn't necessarily mean factually innocent. Again, it means the burden of proving beyond reasonable doubt every element of the offense has not been made. So, for example, let's take something like murder. Murder, by definition, is a crime that involves the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. Unlawful. So it means self-defense can't be murder. Killing of a human being with malice aforethought. So if something's in a passion-provoking incident or a spur of the moment, it's not considered malice aforethought, and so you might be convicted of a lesser crime like manslaughter. But let me throw out a question to you. So what happens, for example, in the case of Scott Peterson? He was convicted of killing his wife, Lacey, and also his unborn son. Now, in California, interestingly enough, the unborn human being it's not considered first-degree murder to kill an unborn baby, but it is second-degree murder. So your definition of the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought, when applied to an unborn human being, still doesn't quite fit according to current law that doesn't legally find the unborn baby as a person. Now, I don't want to get too caught up in this, but I would want to give you a quick overview of the whole issue of abortion. That's not what I'm here to talk about. But in 1973, the Supreme Court decided the case of Roe versus Wade. And the author of the majority opinion, it was 7-2, was Harry Blackmun, appointed by Richard Nixon, a good Republican. Harry Blackmun essentially said that if the unborn human being is a person under the 14th Amendment that gives protection to persons, then the argument fails and abortion would not be allowed. And then he and the majority go on to say that the unborn baby is not a person under the 14th Amendment. There's no personhood. Although people have tried to get a personhood amendment, it still isn't the case. So in essence, Roe versus Wade and its companion case of Doe v. Bolton allowed essentially for abortion on demand all the way up to the time of delivery, if you could just claim at the last trimester of pregnancy that the woman's health is in danger. Anyway, so that's a question of unlawful killing of a human being. So you got to look at the definition. Back to the analysis of what a trial is. In a civil trial, the question is whether or not the person bringing the case, the plaintiff, has proven by the preponderance of evidence, more likely than not, I call it the 50-yard line rule. Football field's 100 yards long. Have you ended up your argument on the other side of the field? You only need a slight amount beyond 50-yard line and you prevail. And that's usually about money, although civil law can also be about things like custody of children and things like that that are deeply important to people and to their families. In any case, whether criminal or civil, the plaintiff or prosecutor has the burden of proving by competent evidence to make their case by evidence that's admissible in a court of law. the party opposing the prosecution in a criminal case or the plaintiff in a civil case can try to rebut the evidence used by the plaintiff or prosecution by giving evidence which is equal or more compelling. And as a result of that, the jury then has to decide who to believe. And do you believe it? Let's use a car accident as a case. And I've handled lots of car accidents in my time. So in a civil trial, let's say Bob, we'll call him Bob. Bob's seeking compensation because he claims that he was injured in a car accident when Debbie ran a stoplight and hit his car and he's injured. Well, to get into court, he's going to have to demonstrate by admissible evidence, and number one, Debbie was at fault, number two, that he was injured, and number three, what his damages are, because you have to have some quantification of what the damages are. So let's say he takes a witness stand, and whether he has a lawyer or not, he testifies, the light was green for me, I got broadsided by this car, and I recognized it afterwards that this was Debbie, the defendant, and I was injured, and I've been to the doctor, and I got my doctor bills. Well, that's not the end of the case. Now, Debbie can get up and say, no, Bob ran the light, and I'm the one that should be collecting from him. So now you got testimony that is competing. So who do you believe? So you have to go to perhaps other witnesses, or you have to reconstruct the accident by looking at where was the impact and things like that to determine who was at fault. So the standard of proof in most civil cases I mentioned is the 50-yard line preponderance of the evidence rule. In the two types of civil trials, you got a bench trial where the judge holding the gavel that he never uses in California makes the call. He decides what the facts are and applies the law. In a jury trial, the jury, typically 12 people, I've had cases where I've tried cases for 8 people in San Bernardino County, the jury decides. Now, you don't need a unanimous jury in a civil case. You need 3/4. So if it's a jury of 12, you only need 9 people out of the 12 to find, and I'm typically representing the plaintiff, find for the plaintiff. If more than 3 people find for the defendant, then you lose the case. I remember trying a case in Orange County, and it was a car accident case. And as I looked at the 12 jurors that we put in the box, we get to ask them questions ahead of time. And the reason for that is try to ferret out any type of biases, because you want an unbiased jury there. And they bring to the table their experience, but they need to listen intently, not make up their mind until all the evidence that comes from the witness stand or admissible documents has been presented. And so as before the trial began, as we started picking the jury, I thought of those 12 jurors that are sitting in the box, there was only one that I knew for sure was on my side. This guy, I think I saw him reading a book like Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So this guy is a Christian. He's going to definitely be on my side. So I went ahead and picked the jury, tried the case, and I won the case. Jury came in 11-1 on behalf of my client. Who was the one who found against my client? The one I thought I had in the bag. So that just tells you something about a jury. Okay, so let's put Christianity on trial. What competent evidence is there that would be admissible in a courtroom that demonstrates Jesus lived, died, rose from the dead, and we have an accurate record of his life? What's competent? And then also, is that evidence compelling? So if we even get it admitted into courtroom, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, here's the life and teachings of Jesus, the jury doesn't have to believe that. It can be admitted into evidence, but then the jury has to weigh the testimony, evident testimony, and decide, is it true? So ultimately, it has to be both competent, that is admissible, the type of evidence that can be relied upon, and secondly, compelling evidence. Okay, so when it comes to evidence admissibility, just being admitted doesn't necessarily mean something is true, and I'm illustrated with Bob saying, the light was green for me, and Debbie says, no, it was green for me. So you've got competing claims. How do you decide? So you have to go beyond that and try to determine what is admissible. Now, there are some types of statements that are considered unreliable. One classic example is what's called hearsay. And a hearsay, by definition, both in the federal rules and also here in California, is a statement made outside of court that you use to prove the issue before the court. So let's say the case of Bob. Bob takes a witness stand and says, well, Bill actually saw the accident, and Bill saw that Debbie was at fault. No, you can't do that. So if the lawyer for Bob says, did Bill tell you who caused the accident? Other side would say objection, calls for hearsay. And the judge would say, your objection is sustained. It's a bad question because it's calling for an out-of-court statement. If you want to bring Bill into or you want Bill's testimony, you bring him into court where he can testify and then be cross-examined. You can ask him questions. Where were you, Bill? What were you doing at the time? Do you have good vision? You can ask him all these questions. So hearsay something that's unreliable. Now, if you took the witness stand as a believer, and I'll just assume for the sake of argument, you're all believers in Jesus. So let's just say we wanted to argue the case for Jesus that he is the Messiah who died and rose from the dead. So I put you on the witness stand. And you take the witness stand, I ask you the question, do you believe Jesus rose from the dead? Opposing counsel is going to say, objection, lacks foundation. Why in the world do you even ask that question? You've not established this person knows anything about Jesus other than faith. Obviously, Jesus was alive 2,000 years ago, so it's just totally not relevant. And the judge would say, sustain. That's a bad question. You can't answer that. So then if I ask the next question, did someone tell you that Jesus rose from the dead? Objection, hearsay, calls for an out-of-state statement to try to prove the matter that you're asserting. Jesus rose from the dead. So other side will say objection, hearsay, and the judge will say sustain. And if the witness blurts out, but William Lane Craig told me Jesus rose from the dead, other lawyer would say, objection, move to strike is non-responsive, Your Honor. This witness is not a percipient witness. Percipient witness is one who saw or heard himself or herself personally the questions that are being addressed by the court. So the judge would say, does this witness have anything further to offer? If not, you're excused. And basically your testimony was stricken because you didn't offer anything that was competent. Nothing was admissible for that question. Now, in contrast to that, let's just say the Apostle John was still around. Now, he's a really old guy by now. He's 2,000 years old. So John kind of shuffles to the witness stand. And now I ask John, did you actually see Jesus being crucified? The other side could say, objection, overruled. It's a good question. He was a percipient witness. And he'll say, yes, I was present when Jesus was crucified. Next question, did Jesus appear to have died on the cross? Objection, calls for medical conclusions. This is a lay witness, overruled. It's a lay opinion. Did Jesus appear to have died on the cross? Yes. Then my follow-up question, well, what did you see that made you believe Jesus actually died on the cross? Well, he stopped moving. The guards didn't break his leg, which they did for the other thieves. They thrust a spear into his side. He didn't move. Blood and water came out separated. And I actually saw his body prepared for burial and didn't move. And they wrapped him in linen cloth and aromatic substance. Okay. So were you present then when Jesus' body was prepared? Yes, I was. And what did you see? Well, they packed in this aromatic substance between the linen cloth. So I actually saw his body. So I knew he had died on the cross. And all of that happened. Were you present when he was placed in the tomb? Yes, I was. And I saw these guys roll this big heavy stone down this incline and block the entrance to the tomb. All right, all right. And at some point after his burial, did you return to the tomb? Yes, I did. When was that? It was about 3 days later. It was Easter morning. What did you find? I found the tomb was empty. Well, it wasn't quite empty, but there were some linen wrappings in the tomb, but Jesus' body was not there. Was anybody with you? Yes, Simon Peter. Okay. At some point after you visited the empty tomb, did you see Jesus alive? Yes, I did. When? On several occasions. Give me an example. Well, one time in the upper room in Jerusalem, and Jesus appeared to us. Thomas wasn't there. Then a few days later, he appeared again when Thomas was there, and Thomas said to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Now, we could also say, how many other people saw Jesus alive beyond the disciples? Well, at one point, there were over 500 people who were present and saw him alive. Thank you. No further questions. All of that was admissible testimony because John was there, a percipient witness. Now, you could choose to disbelieve him. And under cross-examination, someone might say, are you a follower of Jesus? Yes, I am. But I wasn't always a follower of Jesus. Objection, move to strike is non-responsive. Yes, that's stricken. So, John, when did you become a follower of Jesus? Well, he called me and from my fishing. And what makes you believe he really is the Messiah? Well, I saw him do miracle after miracle. No one ever spoke words like he spoke. I saw him crucified, and I saw him after he rose from the dead. Now, no good defense attorney would even ask those questions because basically you're ringing the bell again to give evidence that the plaintiff's case is true. Now, does the New Testament contain competent, that is eyewitness testimony, the type that could be admitted in a law court? If you have your Bible, go to Luke chapter 1. We call this the prologue to Luke's gospel. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Luke says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So Luke writes in Luke chapter 1, verse 2, he says, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Now, the Greek word that's translated, Luke wrote in Greek, as far as we know. The word translated eyewitnesses is autoptai, A-U-T-O-P-T-A-I, we would put it in English, transliterate it. Now, one of the best books out there, if you want to find out a scholarly view of Jesus, is Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It's a great book. It's a little bit heavy, but if you studied the scriptures and have a good background in apologetics, it would be a book worth looking at. Now, Richard Bauckham says that when he talks about the word autopta, he says it does not have a forensic meaning. Forensic means a type you would use in a courtroom. Bauckham says it does not have a forensic meaning, and that it would be misleading to understand the word as a metaphor for the law court. I'm quoting from Bauckham. Bauckham goes on to say that autoptai are simply, or quote, simply firsthand observers of the events, close quote. Well, with respect to Bauckham, who's a great scholar, but not a lawyer, a firsthand observer is an eyewitness in the forensic sense. So he's totally wrong on that, even though I like the guy. I think he wrote a great book. Bauckham makes the point that the eyewitnesses of Jesus were his followers from the beginning. That's also mentioned in John 15:27. You've been with me from the beginning. Acts chapter 1, verses 21 to 22, when they're going to replace Judas with a new apostle, and talked about men who have accompanied us all the time, beginning with the baptism of John until the resurrection. But Bauckham provides a translation of autoptai where he talks about those with personal firsthand experience, those who know the facts at firsthand. Again, there's no meaningful distinction between an eyewitness in a courtroom, in a law court, and those with personal firsthand experience. So what Bauckham is describing is exactly the type of person we see in courtrooms every day testifying to what they saw. That's exactly how it is. So I don't know why he bothers to say it's not used in the forensic sense. Autoptai, Luke 1:2. I say, yes, it is. And I say that as a lawyer who's also had 4 years of Greek. Now, what if a person knows the facts at firsthand? So is Bauckham contending a person like that is somebody who's not a percipient witness? Now, Luke was not a witness, as far as we know, to the resurrection or the life of Jesus. But Luke is an investigative journalist who wrote down the testimony of the eyewitnesses. So he would be similar to a jury who hears testimony and then believes the compelling aspect of that testimony. So if you ask a juror at the end of the case, where the jury concludes Jesus rose from the dead, could say, well, it's based on the testimony of the eyewitnesses. And that's who Luke was. Luke's somebody who didn't see it himself, but he saw compelling evidence, and he lays that out there in Luke chapter 1. Now, let's go to some other eyewitness testimony. 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 and 3. Notice that it emphasizes the empirical nature of the disciples' testimony. By empirical, we mean that which can be seen, can be heard, can be felt. And John says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life, what we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you. Folks, that's eyewitness testimony, a percipient witness. And again, it's competent because he saw it. Is it compelling? Well, he writes his gospel telling us he wrote it so that we might believe. He actually even has an evangelistic purpose for writing his gospel. That doesn't mean it's biased. It just means that he wants you to find what he found. So it is competent, and of course, I believe it's compelling. Now, things like dreams, visions, feelings, these are not the types of things that are admissible in courtroom. Those are the things that are excluded because they're not a reliable basis for determining what happened. Oh, I had a dream that actually Debbie ran the light, and even though I didn't see it because I was looking ahead. No, you don't go with that. Or I had this vision that Bartholomew actually committed the crime. No, we want to hear from a percipient witness. Percipient, one who perceives, one who saw it, who heard it, who touched it. There's the old story, I've told this story about the fellow who was being prosecuted for mayhem. And mayhem, I won't give you the common law definition, but the man was being prosecuted for having been in a fight and biting off the ear of the person he was fighting. So the prosecution brought in the star witness, and the prosecutor was asking questions. Where were you when this happened? Well, I was standing about 30 feet away. And so based on what you observed, are you convinced that the accused is the one who bit off the ear of the victim? Because everybody admits that the guy's ear was bit off. Yes. So it came time for the defense. And sometimes the defense attorneys ask like one too many questions. And the defense attorney first says, so you didn't actually see my client, the accused, bite off the ear of this victim, did you? No, sir, I did not. Well, then how can you say that you believe my client bit off his ear? Because I saw him spit it out. So be careful that you don't ask one too many questions. Now, the only time a non-percipient witness can testify in a courtroom, with a few nuances, would be an expert witness. And an expert is typically someone who's brought in to help the jury understand complex issues of science, or maybe even archaeology, things like that, and to help the jury understand things. Now, fortunately, in Bockham's case, he comes around regarding Luke and uses apoptai and says there's no doubt from the total context of Luke and Acts that Luke, in his writings, it carries a historical sense, meaning people who witness firsthand the events of the gospel story, which is exactly what's required in a courtroom. Somebody to testify who actually saw it. Empirical evidence, sight, touch, smell. That's the evidence. Bauckham mentions in his use of autoptai Josephus, and how Josephus uses that term in the same sense of being an eyewitness. I won't give you all the nuances of that, but Josephus uses that word autoptai that Luke 1:2 uses. And you can find that in Bockham's book. If you look up the term autoptai in Moulton and Milligan or one of these standard vocabulary of the Greek Testament, they will talk about how in the first century that word was used for someone who actually had firsthand acquaintance, basically an eyewitness to the events. So that's what we find out, that Luke got his story from the eyewitnesses. That's what you want in the courtroom, eyewitness testimony. Now, there are some New Testament terms that are similar to autoptai. If you have your Bible, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 16, and many of you have heard that verse before. Peter writes, we did not follow cleverly devised fables, the Greek word is mythoi or myths, when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Now that word is the word, not autoptai, but optes. And the word optes, you hear the word optic from that, optics, to see. So basically it's one who perceives, one who sees, one who actually was a spectator. So same thing we see in Luke 1:2, just a different word, but the same type of connotation. And many of the lexicons will say this was probably a reference to the transfiguration, you go to Matthew chapter 17, where Peter, James, and John are taken up onto the mountain, and Jesus sees Moses and Elijah, and Jesus' countenance is transfigured. And a lot of people think that Peter was a spectator, so he's talking in 2 Peter 1:16 about him being an eyewitness to Jesus being transfigured. Also, in terms of eyewitness testimony, similar to autopsy, John chapter 20, verse 25, and I've referred to Thomas previously, and Thomas is quoted as saying, "Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails and put my fingers in the place of the nails, put my hand in his side, I will not believe." So Jesus had appeared to the 10 disciples in the upper room after the crucifixion. Thomas was absent. When the other disciples later told him, "We have seen the Lord," Thomas uttered his famous words of doubt as recorded in John 20:25. I want to see and feel. I want to be a percipient witness. I want to touch him. I want empirical evidence. That's kind of interesting. Why would that be? That after following Jesus for 3 years, and on many occasions Jesus claimed he was going to rise from the dead. You can go to Matthew chapter 16, verse 21. From that time forward, Jesus began to tell them that he would have to be crucified, and the third day he would rise from the dead. And then after 10 disciples tell him Jesus appeared to us alive, why wouldn't Thomas believe that? Well, we're not really told, but what we are told is that when Jesus appears, Thomas didn't even have to touch Jesus because he could see and perceive, and says the great confession of John chapter 20, verse 28, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are not percipient witnesses, who have not seen with your eyes, but yet believe." You believe based on the testimony of the eyewitnesses, and that's what we have in the Gospels. So this is similar, again, to a courtroom, empirical evidence. Jesus gives his blessing to those who don't have empirical evidence, but similar to a courtroom during a jury trial where the jury has not seen the events, but the jury hears testimony about the events from witnesses on the witness stand, and based on the testimony that comes from the witness stand, they render their verdict, and the verdict means that which is true. And in some cases, the verdict has life or death consequences. So by way of conclusion, Luke's use of autopsy in Luke 1:2, it's consistent with the common use of the term eyewitnesses as used in a law court. It is exactly what we would expect if someone were to testify in a courtroom in any state in the United States. No reason to hold otherwise. And the events of the Gospel of Luke were derived from those who did observe firsthand the life and teachings of Jesus. Luke's make it clear that he has investigated everything carefully, Luke 1:3, to write an account in consecutive order, Luke 1:3, that we might know the exact truth, Luke 1:4. Unlike journalists today who only want to cover that which supports their point of view, Luke wanted us to know the truth. So Luke, the investigative journalist, he makes the case, as do Matthew and Mark and John, those Gospels, that Jesus indeed died for the sins of the world, rose from the dead to demonstrate he was the Christ, and believing in him, we have life through his name. And so believing in the gospel accounts of Jesus is consistent to believing in multiple eyewitnesses who testify in a law court, and we render our verdict based on how competent, how admissible the testimony is, and how compelling, how convincing or persuasive the testimony is. And the verdict found in the gospel record is simple: Jesus is Lord. He died on a cross, rose from the dead, and he's coming again. So let me summarize the eyewitnesses. So Peter's an eyewitness of the life and teaching of Jesus. Peter's account, by the way, his account of the life of Jesus is given to Mark. According to Papias, who writes early 2nd century, around AD 110, 115, Papias writes that Peter gave his gospel to Mark. Mark wrote down those things that Peter as an eyewitness saw. That's what we find. Luke's not an eyewitness, but Luke interviewed the eyewitnesses. So what he gives us, and as an investigative journalist, is primary source testimony. John, the gospel writer, the apostle, is certainly an eyewitness. So in a courtroom today, if Peter and John were alive, they could testify as to exactly what they saw and heard because they're percipient witnesses. And the gospels could be admitted into evidence today in both federal and the state courts under what's called the ancient document rule. And under the federal rule, if a document is more than 20 years old, regular on its face, no signs of obvious alterations, and found in a place of natural custody or where it would be expected to be found, that document can be authenticated and put into evidence. And again, by putting it into evidence, it means it's competent, but it doesn't mean the jury has to believe it. The question then is it compelling? Is it persuasive? But it could be admitted into evidence. Same thing in California. Evidence Code 1331 has to do with something, writing that's more than 30 years old, and the statements have generally been acted upon as true by people who have an interest in the matter. Sounds like the Bible to me, sounds like the Gospels. So the Gospels could be admitted into evidence, even though the jury is free to believe or disbelieve. So actually it's compelling, or I should say, yeah, it's competent. The question is it compelling? So the step one, is the gospel evidence admissible? And the answer, yeah, it is. We have eyewitness accounts, and we have accurate records of those accounts. The next question is it compelling? Is it believable? And that is, does it have explanatory power? And you can go a lot of places here. You can talk about the disciples and how several of them went to violent deaths to tell us the story. That's pretty good evidence or testimony they actually believed it, whether it was true or not. So the question is it indeed persuasive? And history is defined as a record of the past based upon testimony. Is the history in the Gospels reliable? And I've written a book called In Defense of the Gospels. You can pick this up on Amazon. And I basically make the case in this book by addressing the 6 questions that both Christians and even skeptics want to know. Why should we believe the Gospels are accurate accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus? And I deal with, well, when were they written? Who wrote them? Were these writers biased? And I deal with, have the Gospels come down to us as they're written? Does archaeology confirm what they have to say? And these types of things. So those are the 6 questions. You can pick that up some other time. In Defense of the Gospels, available on Amazon. Not all testimony, indeed, in a courtroom is necessarily reliable. So I'm going to play this little video from a movie that has a few spots in it where the language is not too great, but I find this is a pretty funny movie. And this is called My Cousin Vinny. And if you know the case, there's these 2 college kids on their way from New York to go to UCLA. They're driving through Alabama and they get pulled over and arrested for murder. And they thought that they had shoplifted a can of tuna unwittingly. And so this is the scene where Sheriff Farley, I'm gonna hold this up and hopefully you can hear it, but Sheriff Farley is trying to get the confession out of Ralph Macchio, who is one of the 2. So let me play this for you.
You paid for the groceries.
I don't hear it.
It's playing.
Can you hear it?
Yes. Yes.
What?
No sound. No sound.
That's what I was asking. Can you hear it? Oh, let me get the sound on here. Let me start over here. All right, technical difficulties. We'll get this going here. Can you make sure this is at full volume? It's one of these where it was working before we began tonight. And then there is a way of actually sharing the screen. My wife can do it on her laptop, not on mine. Technical difficulties. Okay, here we go.
You paid for
sound?
the groceries. And then what?
We went out to the car, and that's it.
When'd you shoot him?
What?
At what point did you shoot the clerk?
I shot the clerk.
Yes, when did you shoot him?
I shot the clerk.
Hey, Dean, you need you out here? I'm in the middle of a damn confession here.
Whoa! Wait a minute!
I asked him if he did it, and he said, I shot the clerk. I asked him again, and again he said, I shot the clerk. Your Honor.
So there was I think a funny example of how the testimony was admissible. It was competent, but it was not compelling because he obviously was questioning that. But as it's written down on paper, it doesn't have the same inflection, and the jury's free to disregard that. So I think that was a funny little example of that. So does the New Testament contain eyewitness testimony? Yes, it claims to. If you look at Mark relaying Peter's eyewitness testimony, Luke relaying eyewitness testimony, John giving his own account, Paul relaying his own experience outside of the Gospels. If you look at Luke's use of the word autoptai, these are eyewitnesses. These are not people who heard from somebody who heard from somebody. It's not hearsay. It's actually percipient witnesses. And his use of the word autoptai and Peter's use of the word optes are consistent with the courtroom forensic use of the term eyewitness, which makes it competent to be admitted into a courtroom and can be believed by the jury. And also, the gospel accounts show that these books were written by first century Palestinian Jews who were there, as opposed to someone like a Bart Ehrman who said, we don't know who wrote them, we don't know when they wrote them, they didn't write them anywhere near Palestine. Well, that's interesting if they didn't. By the way, there's no surviving traditions of anyone other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John writing the Gospels. None. And if Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John didn't write these Gospels, the question is, well, then who did? The Gospels have many, many reasons, or present many reasons to show they were written by first century Palestinian Jews who were there at the time. One of the lines of evidence, and I can't go into all these, Bauckham goes into some, there's a Jewish lady, an Israeli named Tal Elon, who wrote 4 volumes where she researched the names of people in both Palestine and also in Egypt amongst both male and female Jews. And she listed all those together and showed that certain names were so popular. In fact, let me give you a quiz now. What was the most popular name in the first century for a Jewish male? Does anybody know the answer to that? Most popular name? Anybody want to hazard a guess? I don't hear anything being hazarded. I see John. No, it's a good try though, Shannon. It's Simon. And for women, clearly it was Mary. Okay, now what Tal Elon points out is that anytime, well, what she points out is the usage of the names and how the most common names all the way down to like the 100th most common names. If you look in the Gospels, there are some names that like Simon would be like Smith today, or Gwyn or Chan in some other countries. What you find then is that certain names, because they're ambiguous. So in the Bible, if the word Simon is mentioned, Simon who? And so there's what's called a disambiguation. That means adding something else to distinguish all the different Simons. So you've got, for example, Simon Peter, you got Simon the leper, Simon the zealot, Simon the Cyrenian, but you notice they all had disambiguations. So tell us who they are, because Simon was one of the most common names. This is true for the top 10, Simon, Matthew, James, Judas, the top 11 have disambiguations. Tal Elon demonstrates these are the most common names in Palestine. No one would know that. Then when you go to people like Bartholomew, Thaddeus, and Thomas, no disambiguation. It's not Thomas son of or Bartholomew son of, because those are very uncommon names. So they didn't have to be disambiguated. How did the writers of the Gospels know to latch onto these and to give disambiguations for the common names unless they lived there? Now, what about geography? So for example, if somebody said they live in Orange County, they're going to go down to Big Bear, you'd say, this person's not from Southern California. You don't go down to Big Bear, you go up to Big Bear. Well, the same way in the Gospels, from Galilee, they go up to Jerusalem. But Jerusalem's south. Wouldn't you go down to Jerusalem? No, you go up, because geographically, Galilee is below sea level. But Jerusalem is 3,000 feet above sea level, so you go geographically up. You wouldn't know that unless you were familiar with the area. So things like that, or even the bodies of water, the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee for a fisherman who's never even seen the Mediterranean, the Sea of Galilee was the sea. That was it. And so for Peter, for James, for John, that was the sea. So when you see them talk about the Sea of Galilee, it's called the sea. Unless you were a fisherman living in the region of Galilee, you'd probably call it something else. So for example, when Luke talks about the Sea of Galilee, you know what he calls it? He calls it a lake. More evidence that Luke, who was probably from Antioch, was not a fisherman. He was familiar geographically, but yet he wasn't somebody who grew up there. And these are just some of many lines of evidence of geography, of customs, of people, of places. Colin Heber, the classicist, shows it in Luke's gospel, tracing the apostles' missionary journeys. There's like over 60 confirmed names, places, locations, titles that have been confirmed by archaeology. So we see confirmation, not the Gospels being written by someone far removed. If they did, somehow these people either had direct contact and wrote the records of the eyewitnesses, or they themselves were eyewitnesses. So in essence, it becomes the same. So I'll conclude with this. The gospel accounts of the life of Jesus are not only competent, admissible in a courtroom, but they're also compelling. They're persuasive. They have explanatory power. You could even go back to things like Bible prophecy and say, arguably, there's even supernatural forces at work. Now, with the non-Christian, I don't necessarily go there, but yet the scriptures predict things in the gospel, such as the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. But you've got the life and teachings of Jesus multiply attested. Gary Habermas likes to use that term, multiple attesticity, multiply attested by the gospel writers, by early church. And you've even got secular historians like Josephus, like Tacitus, like Suetonius, like Marabar Serapion. You have Pliny, Trajan, the emperor. You have all these people confirming the historicity of Jesus within 75 to 80 years of his existence. And so these key events are corroborated by contemporaries like Josephus. You've got the criterion of embarrassment, that the Gospels are not written as a sanitized version. In fact, that would be something that would be important in a courtroom. In courtroom, if 4 people take the witness stand, they all tell the exact same story in the exact same order, using the exact same words, you'd say, it's not that reliable because they've obviously corroborated on this, and it's more like you had one testimony. We've got the Gospels looking at it from 4 different perspectives, and also in the process of that, the Gospels don't merely tell the good, but they also tell the negative. Jesus tells his disciples who've been with him for 3 years to watch and pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. What do? They fall asleep. After Jesus does miracles, they ask the question, what manner of man is this that the sea obeys him? So you see many, many cases where the gospel writers aren't putting themselves forward as being the heroes. And so, for example, and guys, you can relate to this. Who is at the cross of Christ as he's being crucified? Now, if they were just making up this account of the crucifixion, if Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John were making this up, who are they going to put there at the cross? They're going to put the disciples there being held back in chains from rescuing Jesus. It's not what you find. You find one man, one disciple, John, and 3 women. 3 women who had the courage to defy the authority of Rome by being there as Jesus bled out for the sins of the world. No guy would write that unless it was true. The guys would have had all the men lined up there being held back under penalty of death. No, they weren't there. They were hiding in fear. So the idea of embarrassment, called the criterion of embarrassment, is another example. So I could go on and on from there. So the question then is the Christian message and the eyewitness testimony, is it compelling? Is it competent evidence that can be admitted in a courtroom? It's the same type of evidence we admit in courtrooms every day. Is it compelling? Yes, it is, because it's changed the lives of countless millions of people who considered it, who've investigated it, like Luke, and have come to the conclusion that indeed Jesus is who he claimed to be. So if I were in a courtroom right now and giving my summation, after you present your opening statement, and you bring out the testimony, then your summation, the last thing before the jury deliberates and determines what's true, I would say that the evidence for Christianity being true is indeed compelling. And when you put Christianity on trial, you come to the conclusion Jesus lived, he died, he rose from the dead. The testimony of the death and resurrection of Jesus is a type of evidence that is both admissible and compelling, and it is true. So the only verdict that is proper for those who are listening, the jury, those we witness to, those who hear the message, is the same thing that Matthew wrote in Matthew chapter 16, verse 16, quoting Peter, when Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am?" And then he turned it and said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter stood up and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That is a verdict. With that, the defense rests. Jane, does anybody have any questions? I'd be happy to entertain them.
Yeah, so if anybody has a question, you could unmute your mic and ask.
Yeah, I have a quick question about the Greek. Could you spell out each of those words again?
Sure, you want me to spell them in English or in Greek?
In English.
Okay. Autoptai, A-U-T-O-P-T-A-I, A-U-T-O, auto, P-T-A-I, autoptai. And then the one that Peter uses in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16 is ep opte, E-P, let me see how I write it in English, E-P, O-P-T-A-I. Let me make sure that I got that right. I had it transliterated here somewhere, but I've reshuffled my pages. So give me a second. Let me just confirm that. Here we go. E-P-O-P-T-A-I-S, optase, 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 E-P-O-P-T-A-I-S, optase. So that would be 2 Peter 1:16, and John chapter 1, or 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, John just explains how he is an eyewitness, the things we've touched, we handled, we've seen with our eyes, etc. But autoptai is the one that, for whatever reason, Richard Bauckham says it was not really used like in a courtroom. And my conclusion is it absolutely is. It's exactly what we use in courtrooms. Autoptai, A-U-T-O-P-T-A-I. Hope I spelled it right the same way every time. Hope that helps, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you.
Good.
Hey, John. So I have a quick question on that. So I haven't read specifically Baukham's book, but is the context for him saying that? Is he saying just within its historical context, it didn't have any legal meaning, which of course wouldn't preclude that it, in our context would be account for that. But is he just saying that historically it had no special legal meaning, or is he outlining, or is he ruling out that it has even legal meaning today?
That's really a good question. I think what he's trying to say is that it's a standard word that's used, both the word itself and the concept, in ancient historiography, that historians would use that type of term in these types of situations, not necessarily as a forensic term, but as something that's standard. And I agree, that's true. But he didn't need to say it's not in the forensic sense, because my point is that's also standard historiography. That which is percipient by someone who's an eyewitness is exactly what it is. So I think he just didn't need to go out of his way to say, well, it's not used in a legal sense, it's in a historiographic sense. Well, so my point is they're actually, I think, one and the same, at least based on the way he argues it. But you raise a good point. He's just trying to say that's just a standard historiography. But isn't that what a trial's all about? Is to find out what happened. That's what history is, the record of the past based on testimony. And a courtroom is about what happened based on testimony. So law courts are places for true history to be presented. So that's why he's a great writer, great theologian, great apologist, but he didn't, in my estimation, didn't need to limit it because it's exactly what I use in a courtroom when I present a case to a jury.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anybody else have questions? Hey, John, do you have questions for the crowd, maybe?
Well, I asked the one question and nobody got that one. What was the most common name? Of course, that's kind of Bible trivia. It's worth looking at what Tal Ilan has said. And you don't have to even spend all the money necessarily to buy Bockham's book. You can get a abridged version of a similar information by Peter Williams from Tyndale House in England. And I've talked to Peter and corresponded, and I met him. He has a copy of my book as well, but he goes into that disambiguation issue to show that, to try to refute the what I think is the unnecessary, shallow attacks by Bart Ehrman, who claims that, well, we don't know who wrote the Gospels. They certainly weren't in Palestine. If they weren't in Palestine, the evidence is compelling that they had to write the accounts of someone who was there. But Ehrman won't give you that any more than when Ehrman wrote his book, his first book, questioning the reliability of the gospel accounts. A lot of Christians said, you know, Bart, nowhere do you, when you talk about variations, variant readings, variations between the manuscripts, nowhere do you say that no Christian doctrines are resting on a disputed reading. And it's pretty clear that that's the case, and you believe that, we believe. Why haven't you put that in your book? Well, the answer obviously is sells more books, and you can end up higher up on the New York Times bestseller list by sensationalizing and putting all the negative stuff. So Ehrman took that to heart. So in his revision of his book, Misquoting Jesus, he includes a statement about how no doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed reading. But where does he put that? It's a footnote on like page 253, and it's so hidden that it's disingenuous. So I don't think Ehrman, and in my book, I take him to task in a couple areas. I don't think he's being fair. And I think in many cases he tries to be a fair guy, but when he says the Gospels were written, we're not sure by who and not sure when, et cetera, et cetera. Read Peter Williams and find out just the evidence of disambiguation, of geography, just the whole idea when the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and John, talk about the Sea of Galilee as the sea. They don't even call the Sea of Galilee in many cases, yet Luke calls it a lake. There's further evidence that, that whoever wrote the Gospels had to be there. And they know the geography, they know the names. There's another book I should point out by Lydia McGrew called Hidden in Plain View. And the subtitle is Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. And these are the things that help show how accurate and in many cases just amazing gospel accounts are, little things that you wouldn't even think about till they're pointed out, and undesigned coincidences to give further credence to the reliability of the gospel accounts. So that, and then I think I've showed you the books I need to show you. I started out by talking about satanic ritual abuse, which is no longer a big deal, but it sure was back in the 80s, 70s and 80s and so forth. If you ever want a book that deals with how to talk to people about that, Bob and Gretchen Passantino's book, and they're both deceased now, but they're great Christian writers and apologists, called When the Devil Dares Your Kids. I actually wrote the preface to that book, and it kind of lays out a more biblical approach to satanic scares, demonology from a biblical perspective, not from a sensationalistic perspective. And it's too bad when you have the Mike Warnkeys and the Lawrence Stratfords of the world who give a bad name to Christianity when, for whatever reason, they tell a bunch of lies, then their lies are exposed. Well, there's an old Latin expression we use in the courtroom, falsus uno, falsus omnibus. So if you're false in one area, you're probably false in another. And we use that in a courtroom. If we can catch someone in a lie, it's called impeachment. You have questioned, if not destroyed, the credibility of the witness by bringing out something they said that was untrue or inconsistent or an outright lie. And you get asked the famous question, so today you're saying X. When I took your deposition, you said Y. Were you lying then or were you lying now? Now, the judge will probably sustain an objection for being argumentative, but the jury will hear that and they'll get it. So anyway, credibility of witnesses. That's always an issue in a courtroom. It's always an issue when it comes to religion, and in Christianity in particular. Are the witnesses credible? And that's why we demonstrate the credibility, the compelling aspect of the testimony of the Gospels, the ring of truth we call in a courtroom. What has the ring of truth when you hear the different accounts, a skeptic's account versus an eyewitness account? So I don't have any more questions for you guys. I didn't prepare a quiz. I guess I could have, but wanted to be kind. I hope everybody's registered to vote and either has voted or will vote by tomorrow.
Did it today.
Yeah, I voted early too. So if nobody else has any questions, we could all go to sleep now.
Hey, thank you, John. I appreciated that presentation. It was great.
Hey, enjoyed it. I appreciate you guys and Jane doing what she does. And let me close with some prayer and pray for your health and for the election tomorrow, for the direction of not just our country, but the world. Let me just say that 4 years ago, the end of November, I was in Nigeria, in Jos, Nigeria, teaching apologetics to about 25 handpicked Christian leaders. When I got there, and Donald Trump had just been elected like 2 weeks before, they told me when we heard Donald Trump was elected, we gave thanks to God because they believed that it was a whole new day for the world, not just for America, but for the world. I'm not saying Trump is any kind of savior, but that just shows you the impact, not just in the US, but in the entire world. Elections have consequences. Let me pray for us now. Father, we come to you in Jesus' name, thanking you that we don't know what the future holds, but we know that you hold the future. Pray for the health of each one here, Lord, that you could keep us free of this pandemic, this virus. Keep us safe and in your grace, Lord. We pray for our country and for the world, but our country in particular, as the votes are counted tomorrow, that there won't be unrest, but there will be a clear, decisive victory of someone, that our nation can be healed, that we can pull together and then realize that our citizenship is in heaven and that our task here is to make disciples of all nations. So help us, Lord, to that end to realize what our calling is. So I pray, Lord, that you would give us grace to make sure that calling, give us the means to accomplish that for the reason you put us here. And for that, we thank you and give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank you, Jane.
John. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.